So my presentation builds on a previous study on Indigenous people in the New Zealand Defence Force and the Canadian Armed Forces. And this paper further investigates the successful participation of the Maori in the New Zealand military. The paper uses organizational culture theory as a framework to analyze the key mechanisms, that is to say, the strategies, approaches, and practices adopted by the New Zealand military, which have facilitated the partnership and mutual understanding between the Maori and the Pākehā, that's to say, the non-Maori or Caucasian. These mechanisms, supported by the external and the internal environments, have created an open and inclusive organizational culture that has enabled the organization to embrace Indigenous culture on the one hand and empower the Maori on the other. I'm gonna see if this works. Fantastic. You'll see in the background a little bit of a slideshow that is just going to go for a couple of minutes. And those are pictures that were taken during the previous, when I was basically doing a little bit of field work for this previous study, which was a comparative study conducted during a visit to New Zealand as part of an exchange between the Canadian and the New Zealand Departments of Defense. It was called the CANZEX in October 2007. The objective of the exchange was for the Canadian delegation to visit various military bases and establishments in order to observe firsthand the approaches and the initiatives used to integrate Maori culture in the New Zealand Defence Force, while at the same time the Canadians had the opportunity to illustrate to their New Zealand Defence Force's colleagues all of the Canadian Armed Forces Indigenous programs that the General outlined to us for us today, aiming to increase participation of Indigenous people in the CAF. The methodology adopted to inform this particular paper is mainly qualitative, aside from some numeric data on Maori representation. In addition to the paucity of available scholarship in this domain, the author wishes to acknowledge that the fact that she's not Indigenous may be considered by some as a limitation of this paper. Indeed, this may be the case for many other scholarly works. For example, Nora Reisman, an Australian historian, acknowledges that the majority of historians writing about Indigenous military service are not Indigenous. With these words in mind, the role of a non-Indigenous scholar interested in Indigenous research can be seen as an objective storyteller while being mindful and respectful of Indigenous culture. To help us understand and make sense of the role that organizational culture plays in this context, the work of Edgar Schein can provide a useful framework of analysis. We can apply Schein's model of organizational culture and associated 3 levels of culture to military organizations. So according to Schein, the culture of a group is a pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration, which has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to these problems. In other words, organizational culture is the way that we do things and then we accept them in an organization. So according to Schein, there are 3 levels of culture: artifacts, espoused value, and underlying assumptions. And within an organization such as the military, there are very clear examples of all of these 3 levels of culture. So artifacts are things that are visible, that can be uniforms, regulations, rules, parades, etc. If we look at the espoused values, beliefs, and norms, these are things that are a little bit less visible. So things are like the value that is placed on the leadership, the value that is placed on the chain of command, on teamwork, etc. Finally, basic underlying assumptions are those solutions and approaches that are taken for granted by a group because they worked well in the past, and so they are just accepted as the group's behavior. These are a little bit harder to change. And so, for example, military members might believe that if they are involved in a humanitarian mission, they're the best people for the job because they have the most capability. Whereas a similar way, a civilian department in the same mission might think differently. So given the visible and invisible levels of organizational culture in a military organization where achieving cultural diversity is very challenging, how do we explain New Zealand's military success in embracing Indigenous cultural values and introducing Indigenous cultural training within the organization, as well as supporting the participation of Indigenous groups in the New Zealand military? The answer resides partly in the mechanism in place by the New Zealand Defence Force, which we'll explore in a little bit later in the paper, and also partly by the supportive internal and external environment, which I'll talk about it in a little bit. For now, just a very, very brief overview of the literature. So there's not a lot of literature on this topic, but what in terms of just to provide a little bit of a background, it's important to acknowledge the 28th Maori Battalion, which was formed in 1939, and it was organized on a tribal basis in 4 companies and departed overseas in May of 1940. Another thing that it's important to recognize is the current integration of Maori knowledge within the New Zealand Defence Force. So there's a little bit of literature on that particular topic as well. So, and finally, there's a little bit of literature on how other organizations in the corporate sector in New Zealand have incorporated Maori knowledge. And so there's a very interesting article about New Zealand, the New Zealand, where am I? The Air New Zealand, and how they've incorporated Maori knowledge, Maori language, and Maori values into their organization. So if we look at the external environment, so outside of the New Zealand Defence Force, there is the foundation of the relationship between the Maori and non-Maori is provided by the Treaty of Waitangi. So the Maori arrived in New Zealand from Polynesia in 800 AD, and in 1840 they signed the Treaty of Waitangi with Britain, whereby they ceded sovereignty to Queen Victoria while retaining territorial rights. During the colonial rule, there were many land wars which culminated in Britain's victory and caused the deterioration of the relationship between the Maori and the Pākehā. And jumping ahead, this relationship has largely improved over the years. As well, Maori are a growing population in New Zealand. So at this time, as of the 2013 census, they basically have increased 5.9% since the last census and almost 40% in the past 22 years. And now they represent about 15% of the population. The other thing that's important to recognize is that although the Maori have experienced similar histories of colonization as other indigenous groups, say in Australia or in Canada or in the United States, during the last decades, the government of New Zealand has made giant steps in trying to restore this relationship. And one of the things that they have done is, as of 1987, there's a Maori Language Act, and the Maori language is now, the Te Puni Kokiri is one of the official languages of New Zealand, along with English and Sign Language. So let's look now at the internal environment within the New Zealand Defence Force. So New Zealand is a small country, so therefore it has a small military. And so based on some data that I received from the New Zealand Defence Force headquarters, the data I had data from 2003 to 2017, and there was a steady increase in Maori representation, except for the last year in 2017, where the Maori were about the same as in the population of New Zealand. But in every other year, Maori were where there was a higher representation of Maori people in the military than in the regular New Zealand population. And they're slightly more, significantly more represented in the other ranks, what we will call in Canada, non-commissioned member ranks, than in the officer rank. Having said that, over the years, their representation is slightly increasing in the officer ranks. So these are our numbers. So I just picked 2009 because it was the year with the highest representation of Maori. So you can see that they were at 18.3% of the regular force, and whereas in 2017, they were about 14.6%, so very close to the regular population of New Zealand. So what are some of the initiatives that the New Zealand Defence Force has put in place in recognition of the importance of Maori culture and knowledge within the organization? And these have been put in place throughout the years. So these have not happened overnight. But to start fairly recently, a New Zealand Defence Force bicultural policy. So this is for the whole defence, which recognizes Maori cultural interest and the special place of Maori within the New Zealand Defence Force. It helps meet the New Zealand Defence Force obligations to recognize the aims and aspirations of Maori people, to respect and honor Maori language, customs, and items of cultural significance within New Zealand Defence Force, and enhance military ethos, fighting spirit, and camaraderie. There are also bicultural policies within each of the services. So the New Zealand Army has a cultural policy, and the Royal New Zealand Navy and the Royal New Zealand Air Force have a bicultural policies. There's also a marae, the Maori meeting place, for each of the services. So there's one in Waiouru for the Army, there's a service marae for the Navy, and there's one for this is the most recent one that was just recently established for the Air Force. And what happens in the military marae, they are at the center of Maori ceremony, cultural training, and other learning that the New Zealand Defence Force services put in place. They're also cultural advisor, Maori cultural advisor for each of the services to support and advise the leadership and other personnel. There are Maori cultural groups, kapahaka. There's Maori language training and cultural training that is provided to members. There's also, they've created haka, so the Maori dance that you've probably seen on a lot of YouTube videos or on TV for each of the services. And the haka dance can be performed in very, very different type of occasions. It can be an expression of pride, welcome, farewell, sorrow, or joy. So when we talked about Indigenous culture training, we might think, oh, perhaps this is only for senior officers or senior non-commissioned members. In fact, it's introduced at all ranks. So, for example, for the Army, on the last week of each course that takes place at the Army Tactics School, the students, including the foreign students that may be attending the course, they attend the New Zealand Army Marae to learn about New Zealand Army ethos within the Army genealogy, the New Zealand Army values, and how the Maori customs and culture fit in the New Zealand Army. Now, other organizations are also do similar things, like I said to you, including the New Zealand Police. So, for example, they have programs in place to recruit Maori police officers, a core value of commitment to Maori, and the Treaty of Waitangi. And it's a program called Turning of the Tide that aims to reduce Maori overrepresentation in crime stats as both victims and offenders, as well as having a specific department to increase diversity issues. They have Maori assistant commissioners, they have deputy commissioners there, Maori, and so on. So, basically in the discussion of the paper, which I won't have time to go through very much, the question that I ask is, so having looked at how is the New Zealand Defence Force and other New Zealand organizations, both in the corporate sector, but also the police, for example, have introduced Maori culture and embraced Maori cultural values, how can other organizations recognize and integrate Indigenous culture and values, and specifically, how can these be incorporated into local military systems and protocol? Okay, fantastic. So we saw that. So that's the question that I ask. I won't go too much into details, but basically, based on the feedback that I received from the point of contacts in New Zealand, a lot of things need to be done. Nothing should be a quick fix. Nothing should be just a one-size-fits-all, and nobody gets a second chance to gain local trust. So a lot of things are more in the paper for you to read. At the end, I conclude that the New Zealand Defence Force can be considered a leader among military organizations in transforming the organizational culture and enabling the organization to embrace Indigenous culture, and also empowering the Indigenous members within their ranks. Thank you.